I'm Maggie Williams, editor of Pensions Insight magazine. Welcome to our expert panel debate on rethinking retirement. There have been many changes in the retirement landscape recently that may address the balance between employer, employee and state provision in retirement. Let's discuss some of those issues.
I think ultimately it's everyone, but I think that there's quite a lot of restructuring that needs to be done to ensure that works, and some of that, of course, is already planned. So auto enrolment will be a big push to sharing the burden between those three groupings. I think probably the key issue is around how that is communicated and making people feel as though this is something that's actually good and helpful for them, as opposed to what might appear to be a burden for them, and actually they'd rather be spending money elsewhere.
I disagree with you slightly. I don't think it's everyone's responsibility. I think it's certainly the employees and the state's responsibility, but I don't think it's the employer's responsibility. I think the employer can benefit from helping their employees to provide for their retirement, but there's a commercial advantage to them doing it. I don't think it's their responsibility.
And I'll challenge that. Because I would say ultimately it's the employee's responsibility, because they must look after the current day and future. So I think, yes, you may get help from the state and their employer, but we're assuming they're all employed, perhaps. So I think it's down to the employee, no matter what they're doing.
But doesn't both the state and the employer have a vested interest in making sure that people can retire at a point in time?
But the state certainly. If the state doesn't provide a framework to encourage people to save for their retirement, we're all going to become a burden on means-tested benefits or whatever mechanism. There's going to be abject poverty, people sleeping in the gutter when they get to retirement. But I don't think it's the employer's responsibility.
You could say it could be the employer who is ultimately employing that individual at the point where they could retire or have in the past retired. Because if they haven't got adequate benefits to be able to retire, then with the age discrimination legislation as it is, an employer is less able to say to them, right, well, I'm going to move you from a point of working to a point of no longer working, whether you can afford it or not. So that employee will just say to the employer, I'd like to carry on working, please, and I'd like you to carry on paying benefits, and I'd like you to carry on accruing pension benefits, and I'd like you to carry on paying my insurance costs, which will have a knock-on effect on the employer. An ageing workforce, unable to bring younger talent into the business because they can't afford it, costs associated with it, absence costs associated with it. You're going to get to a position where the employer's going to say, actually, I need to do something about that.
Which I think agrees with my point. Well, one observation, first of all, the majority of employees will work for employers who won't see them transition from work to retirement. You'll have had 4 or 5 jobs before you get to the one that's
But there will be an employer holding the baby at the point.
There will be, but that's when they have a commercial advantage or commercial incentive to help the individual. I'm not saying that the employer shouldn't be involved in the process. The employer should be involved, but it's not their responsibility, unless it's a responsibility to themselves and their shareholders.
Do they not have a responsibility because of auto enrolment though? Surely they do.
Oh, they have a legal responsibility. But that's different.
But I think that's the point, is that they do have a responsibility. So they need to now make sure that it works to their advantage.
Yes.
Which I think is your point, Steve.
Yeah, exactly.
Over and above the employer point as well, I think actually there is a moral responsibility in the economic cycle that Steve described, that ultimately employees, to Martin's point, have got to be accountable for their own sustainable income throughout their retirement, i.e. when they hang up their boots from work, they've got to have enough income to be able to live off for the rest of their life, and whether that's through a mixture of jobs, savings, pensions, etc., to reduce the economic burden on the state from having to supply that. I think there is actually a moral obligation on employers to help employees to accumulate enough savings to be able to retire.
I'd agree with that, and to my mind everyone's got a vested interest, and so everybody's got a responsibility, and to try and pretend that one group, employer, employee or government, have not got a responsibility, I think is actually part of the burden that has been created.
One of the big sort of things that's always muted in sort of larger economic debates for pension, particularly in DC, is this savings gap. and it's perhaps slightly disingenuous number, and I think there's been a lot of criticism at it. I mean, when it was originally calculated, for example, they hadn't taken into account pension transfer values in the year that they calculated it. But numbers that I've seen recently in the last 10 years since Stakeholder was introduced, we've gone from a savings gap which was numbered at 27 billion through to recent numbers which were published by Aviva of almost 320 billion. And that sort of number, an increase in a gap between people doing nothing, is surely unsustainable in any environment, and therefore you're only going to get economic sense in encouraging people to save for their retirement by all three parties being fully engaged, whether they're forced to, whether it's a moral obligation.